Never memorize vocabulary if you want to speak fluent English. Learning vocabulary from a random list that you found on Google is actually a terrible way of learning vocabulary. In a minute, I'll prove it to you why, but instead, we need to acquire vocabulary. We need to learn vocabulary naturally, the way native speakers learn. That's why today we will discuss why memorizing words is a terrible way of learning vocabulary. Then I'll share with you 3 rules that you must follow if you want to learn vocabulary fast. In the end, I'll share with you an easy but effective method for learning vocabulary that I myself used in the past that got me to this level of fluency. But first, hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Asim. I'm a polyglot. On this channel, we help young people like you speak English fluently and confidently while enjoying the process. So let's dive in. Let's start with why memorizing words/vocabulary is bad for you and why it doesn't work. In most schools, they give you a list of words that you need to memorize before a test. You have to memorize the list and then they take a test. And that's exactly what happened to me. But it didn't work because after the test I would forget most of the words I learned. That's because it's a wrong way of learning vocabulary. According to the language acquisition theory, we don't memorize a language, we acquire it. We consume it by being in the environment of that language. That's how children learn languages as well. Have you seen a parent who forced his 1-year-old kid to memorize 10 words per day? No, parents don't tell their kids that. Kids just listen to their parents all the time. They're being in the environment of that language and they acquire that language, which we will talk about in a while. Now let's talk about you. If I give you a list of 100 words and I tell you to memorize it in 3 days, 2 things are gonna happen. First, you're gonna hate the process. You're not gonna like it. Nobody likes to look at a piece of paper and constantly cram up and memorize words. It's not a fun way of learning vocabulary. And the second thing is that after 1 week, 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you will forget most of those words. So what's the point of memorizing words then? That's why I think memorizing vocabulary from random lists is actually a terrible way to learn a language. But what should you do instead? Well, I'm going to share with you 3 rules that you must keep in mind when you're learning vocabulary. The first rule is don't memorize vocabulary, acquire it. Don't try to memorize words from a random list or from vocabulary books. Instead, acquire vocabulary through consumption, which is reading and listening. That's how children learn languages as well. They learn languages through consuming, through acquiring. The second rule is learn phrases, not individual words. Don't just learn random words that you see online. Learn the entire phrase or sentences. It will make your conversations more fluent, believe me. For example, if you see this sentence, I'm heading for work, don't just memorize the word heading because you will forget it. Instead, learn the entire sentence. The reason why I say this is because we remember new words by associating them with the words that we already know. And also, once you remember the example of a word, you will be able to use it in conversations. Repeat or use the words you learn. Remember, if you don't use them, you lose them. That's because of something called passive vocabulary and active vocabulary. Passive vocabulary are the words that you can understand but cannot use in conversations yet. And active vocabulary is the opposite. Active vocabulary are words that you can understand as well as use in conversations. Our goal should always be to reduce our passive vocabulary and increase our active vocabulary by converting passive vocabulary into active vocabulary. And the way you do that is by using the words you learn. So if you learn a word and you don't use it, it stays in your passive vocabulary. But if you try to use that word 5 times, 6 times, 10 times in your conversations, then that word will become part of your active vocabulary. So you need to practice your English and use the words you learn. By the way, if you want to practice your English speaking, book a one-on-one call with me. Click the link in the description below. It will take you to a booking page where you can schedule an hour-long conversation with me. If you're interested, let's move on to how I learned vocabulary the easiest and most effective way. As I said in the beginning of this video, we learn vocabulary through acquiring it, through consuming it, and consumption happens in 2 forms, listening or reading. So how I learned vocabulary? Well, I had a small notebook. Every time I would read or listen and I would see or hear a new word that I didn't know, I would write it down immediately in my notebook. But I didn't just write the individual word. I would write the entire sentence, the entire example, so that I could remember it better. I would write the word down in my notebook. I would continue reading or listening. After I would finish reading or listening, I would usually have 5 to 10 words written in my notebook. And whenever during the day I would have some free time, I would look up those words in a dictionary. Personally, I used Cambridge Dictionary because I think it's the best one out there, but you can use any dictionary you want. That dictionary would give me the definition of that word in English so that I could understand what the word meant. I see a lot of people making this mistake here. They use Google Translate for learning new words in English. So basically, when they hear a new word, they type it in Google Translate and they translate that word into their native language, which I think is a terrible way of learning vocabulary. You should never do that. Never translate words into your native language through Google Translate. Instead, learn vocabulary through definitions. Anyways, after understanding what those words meant by learning their definitions, they would go to my passive vocabulary. And then in my conversations, I would try my best to use those words as much as I could so that they go from my passive vocabulary into my active vocabulary. That's pretty much how I learned vocabulary from the beginning up until now. Try this method, it's very effective. I'm sure it will help you. This method is way better than memorizing words from a random ass list that you find on Google. Learning vocabulary is a great step towards fluency, but it's only half of the equation. Only learning a lot of vocabulary will not make you fluent. You need other things as well to speak English fluently and confidently. That's why you have to watch this video in which I shared a 4-step method that will make you fluent in English fast. I used this method myself to get to this level of fluency in English. Okay, I hope this lesson was helpful. Bye for now.